President Levin, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot think of a most difficult time for the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan, to leave his New York headquarters to attend a speaking engagement, even if this engagement is at such a fine place at Yale University than this time. I do not exaggerate when I say that the multilateral system, the international system, is going right now through one of its most testing moments in post-Cold War times. Yet, Mr. Secretary General has decided, in spite of this very difficult situation that the United Nations Security Council is going through, to come with us this afternoon. So I will not use his time and just say that we are extremely pleased and very grateful that you, Mr. Kofi Annan, is here this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, President Zedillo, Mr. President, and what a wonderful welcome. I think if you keep welcoming me like this, maybe Nan and I will move from New York and join you here. Distinguished faculty and dear students, it is a great pleasure for me to visit Yale and to pay tribute to the very important work that will be done by the Center for Globalization. By devoting the remarkable intellectual resources of this institution to the central phenomena of our time, you can help guide us in understanding and grappling with the sweeping changes affecting the world. Let me also say how valuable your Fellows Program promises to be in bringing bright and promising young leaders to Yale and equipping them to help their own nations make the most of globalization. I had the privilege of meeting them. Nan and I spent about 30, 45 minutes with them, and we walked away quite excited about the program and the contribution I expect they will make here and in their respective countries. It has often been said that globalization is what distinguishes our era from all its predecessors. Globalization, we are told, is redefining not only the way we engage the world, but how we communicate with each other. Globalization is commonly understood to describe the increasing flow of goods, services, capital, technology, information, ideas, and labor at the global level, driven by liberalization of policies and technological change. For a time, this logic was borne out by reality. Indeed, it worked so well that in many cases, underlying schisms were ignored in the belief that the rising tide of material growth will eliminate important political differences and social grievances. However, over the past few years, I and many others have urged greater consideration for the potential political backlash in the social as well as economic consequences of globalization if they are left unattended. Today, I would like to share some thoughts with you on an equally important aspect of globalization, namely the potential to be a truly integrating and inclusive force and the very real dangers if it fails to live up to that potential. In other words, just as we worry about the gap between the haves and the have-nots, we need to be equally concerned about the gulf between insiders and outsiders in a globalized world where no border is impermeable and where the privileges, economic as well as political and social, of the few are painfully apparent to those multitudes who still yearn for liberty and opportunity. We need, in short, to direct our energies towards realizing the aspiration inherent in the awkward but revealing Arabic translation of the word globalization, which means literally world inclusivity. World inclusivity. Of course, globalization is not wholly new. As far back as we can trace human history, people have traveled, they have traded, they have been on the move, colonized and migrated, and in the process have transformed the places they came from and the places which they journeyed to. What makes our era different is the degree of interpenetration, the speed with which change is taking place, and the dramatic and ever-growing gaps this process is creating between insiders and outsiders. Today, I wish to suggest that one way to address this new division between those who are benefiting from globalization and those who simply see it as one more manifestation of the inequity of the world is to pursue an inclusive globalization whose purpose lies not only in opening markets, but in expanding opportunity and promoting cooperation. By this I mean the need to ensure that globalization of economies and societies is supported and sustained by a global community to create a wider, more expansive definition of our duties to our fellow men and women in a global village, and to ensure that globalization benefits them all economically, politically, and socially. The question before us, therefore, is not whether globalization is good or bad, but rather how we adapt our policies, priorities, and personal choices to account for the realities of a new era. In a world without walls, we can no longer think and act as if only the local matters, as if we owe our allegiance and solidarity only to those within our immediate vicinity, to our own city or to our own state. Such a world demands that we tear down the walls in our own minds as well, those separating us from them, rich from poor, white from black, Christian from Muslim, from Jew, so that we are able to recognize the untold ways in which we can all benefit from cooperation and solidarity across lines of nationality, race, or economic development. Whether it is in the area of crime, health, the environment, or the fight against terrorism, interdependence has ceased to be an abstract concept and become a reality in our lives. It has become a necessity. This poses real challenge not only to political leaders, but to civil society, NGOs, businesses, labor unions, thinkers, and ordinary citizens of every nation. We need to think and rethink what belonging means, what community means, in order to be able to embrace this fate and embrace the fate of distant people and realize that globalization's glass house must be open to all if it is to remain secure. This will require leaders in every sector to present the choices facing the public in a different light. They need to make the difficult but necessary case that we cannot continue to exclude the poor, the disenfranchised, or those who are denied basic right or liberty and self-determination, or that if we do, we cannot at the same time hope to secure lasting peace and prosperity. Of course, including all those people in our circle of concern won't be easy. We all feel a deeply rooted sense of loyalty to those closest to us, families, friends, fellow citizens of city and country. To say that we, and here I think in particular of those of us privileged to live in the developed world, should include citizens of poor and distant countries in our circle of concern, and to suggest that we have an obligation to help them achieve their rights and opportunities in a spirit of tolerance and diversity is to ask a lot. I recognize that. And yet, does globalization leave us any choice? Either we help the outsiders in a globalized world out of a sense of moral obligation or enlightened self-interest, or we will find ourselves compelled to do so tomorrow when their problems become our problems in a world without walls. There are myriad ways in which nations can act on this imperative: by opening markets for the products of developing countries, by increased development assistance, and here the conference at Monterey on financing for development was a good start, and I'm happy, and I would want to thank President Zedillo once again for the very crucial role he played. As most of you know, he chaired a panel on financing for development with other eminent persons and did produce a wonderful report which made an impact at the conference. So you've got a good man here. By promoting good and transparent governance, by addressing diseases and environmental problems that have not reached our shores, or at least not yet, by recognizing obligations to provide asylum, by fostering a more orderly process of integrating migrants, and by valuing pluralism as an overarching priority in every state. We need to think globally and to consider not only domestic factors, but also international ones as integral to decision-making today in governments, businesses, and organizations. This does not mean uniformity of thought or just one approach. There are quite naturally a great variety of ways that we can think and act globally, and in so doing, celebrate and strengthen global diversity. In this sense, the local is not in opposition to the global, but is infused and enriched with global impulses and influences. Essential to realizing this new reality is a dialogue across nations and cultures based on common values and common concerns. The United Nations itself was created in the belief that dialogue can triumph over discord, that diversity is a universal virtue, and that the peoples of the world are far more united by their common fate than they are divided by their separate identities. This dialogue must take place every day among all nations. Not like that. Among all nations, within and between civilizations, cultures, and groups. But it must be based on a genuinely shared values. Without these values, values rooted in the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, no peace can be lasting and no prosperity secure. That is the lesson of the United Nations' first half century, It is a lesson we ignore at our peril. While it may seem somewhat vague to speak of a globalization based on shared values, the vision of the world it seeks to create is quite clear and quite specific. It is a world defined by solidarity and understanding, tolerance of dissent, celebration of cultural diversity, an insistence on fundamental universal human rights, and belief in the right of people everywhere to have a say in how they are governed. It is a world characterized by the belief that diversity of human cultures is something to be celebrated, not feared. This vision is based on the understanding that we are the products of many cultures and impulses, that our strengths lie in combining the familiar with the foreign. That is not to say that we cannot rightly take pride in our particular faith or heritage. We can and we should. But the notion that what is ours is necessarily in conflict with what is theirs is both false and dangerous. It has resulted in endless enmity and conflict, leading men and women to commit the greatest of crimes in the name of higher power. And it need not be so. People of different religions and cultures live side by side in almost every part of the world, and most of us have overlapping identities which unite us with very different groups. We can love what we are without hating what and who we are not. We can thrive in our own tradition, even as we learn from others and come to respect their teachings. You who are privileged to pursue knowledge and understanding in this great institution know this truth in every day and every hour of your work here. My dear friends, if today, after the horror of 11 September, we see better and we see further, we will realize that humanity is indivisible. New threats make no distinction between races, nations, or regions. A new insecurity has entered every mind, regardless of wealth or status. A deeper awareness of the bonds that bind us all, in pain as in prosperity, has gripped young and old. The process of globalization cannot remain unchanged in face of this recognition. It must be able to benefit those at the margins as well as those at the center, the poor as well as the privileged, the shackled as well as the free. The global reaction to 11 September attacks should give us courage and hope that we can succeed in this fight. The sight of people gathering in every city, in every part of the world, from every religion, to mourn and to express solidarity with the people of the United States proved more eloquently than any words that terrorism is not an issue that divides humanity, but one that unites it. I do not thereby mean to suggest that the aftermath of the attacks, or more broadly, the effects of globalization, have in any way introduced a uniform way that will be beneficial to the broader cause of tolerance and coexistence. Indeed, over the past year, we have witnessed a dramatic rise in acts of anti-Semitism in Europe and elsewhere, and we have seen Muslims become the victims of suspicion, hostility, and even physical attacks in this country and elsewhere. These acts of bigotry and ignorance can be seen as the ugly faces of an exclusive, antagonistic globalization. An inclusive globalization must address all these ills as well. The victims of the attacks of 11 September were first and foremost the innocent civilians who lost their lives and the families who now grieve for them. But peace, tolerance, mutual respect, human rights, the rule of law, and the global economy are all among the casualties of the terrorist acts. Repairing the damage done to the fabric of the international community, restoring trust among peoples and cultures will not be easy. But just as a concerted international response can make the work of terrorists much harder to accomplish, so should the unity born of this tragedy bring all nations together in defense of the most basic right, the right of all peoples to live in peace and security. An all-inclusive globalization will be central to achieving this fundamental goal. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I thank you. Please.
Mr. Secretary General, there are many questions, and given the fact that you have to go back to New York to continue working on the problem that all of us know, we will be able only to transmit a few of these questions to you. We have chosen a few of the most difficult ones. Well, the first one is Saddam Hussein a threat to the international community? If so, how would you suggest dealing with him effectively?
Okay.
I told you.
It really goes straight to the question.
These are very intelligent and keen students.
As you know, Iraq, the dossier of Iraq, which also means Saddam Hussein, has been on the UN dossier for about 12 years now. At the end of the war, resolutions were passed requiring that Iraq be disarmed. The inspectors were sent in from 1991, and they stayed till 98. Between 91 and 96, they did quite a lot of disarmament, destroyed about 900 ballistic missiles, neutralized their nuclear efforts, destroyed some of the chemical weapons. They had less success with biological weapons, but they had by no means finished their work when they had to leave in December 1998. Since then, we've not had inspectors back in Iraq. The Council demands that the inspectors should not only disarm Iraq and ensure that Iraq has been disarmed, but to certify to the Council that the job has been completed, and then the Council would eventually decide to lift sanctions, provided the disarmament function and other resolutions have been implemented. Until that certification has come in and the Council has assured itself that there are no weapons of mass destruction, we will have to assume that Iraq does possess weapons of mass destruction. On Monday and Tuesday, the Chief Inspector Blix met with the Iraqi delegation in Vienna, and they have agreed to cooperate. But of course, there is history to this, and there are member states who believe that the inspectors cannot go back and continue business as usual, and that steps should be taken to strengthen the disarmament regime and the inspectors for them to be able to do their work more effectively. The Council is now discussing that resolution. The resolution has several components. First, that Iraq should disarm and indicate some time frames for certain actions to take place. They will demand that Iraq cooperates fully with the inspectors and give them unimpeded and unfettered access. And if the inspectors were to come back to say that they did not get the cooperation and they could not do their work, the Council will have to take a decision of what to do, which some believe should include the use of force. The question that the Council is also grappling with, should all this be in one resolution or should we have two resolutions? The United States will prefer one resolution, demanding that Iraq disarms, cooperates with the inspectors within a certain prescribed time limit, and if it fails, face all possible consequences. Other Council members would want to have a two-step approach, demand Iraq to perform, demand that it cooperates with the inspectors, send them in, and if they do not get the cooperation, to come back to the Council, and then the Council will pass a second resolution on what action should be taken against Iraq. And so this is where we are. So in short, the Council does not believe that Iraq is clean of weapons of mass destruction, and that certification, that decision, judgment will be based on reports and certification from the inspectors, the UN inspectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. A few weeks before President Bush's speech to the United Nations General Assembly, there was this sense that, and particularly after his West Point speech, there was this sentiment in the sense that the United States would deal with the Iraqi question without going through the United Nations, and even without going through the US Congress. What would have happened, Mr. Secretary General, to the multilateral system, and particularly with the United Nations, if the United States had decided to go it alone in dealing with the Iraqi question?
I think it would have been a real challenge to the multilateral system. As I indicated in my statement to the General Assembly on the 12th of September, that each country has an inherent right under Article 51 of the UN Charter to defend itself when attacked. But when a country decides, or a group of countries decide to do something about broader threat to international peace and security, I don't see any other option than to go to the Security Council and the UN for legitimacy and for endorsement and authorization to take that action. And if we do not insist on that minimum order, I think we could find ourselves in a very difficult world where countries can decide to take action against countries, not because they are threatened or they've been attacked, but they see a broader threat to international peace and security. That responsibility under the Charter belongs to the Security Council.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary General, what do you think the United Nations can do with regard to the resolution of the Kashmir issue? It says in India, but also in Pakistan.
Yeah. Well, we have observers on the ground, but not that they are going to solve the problem. I think the UN and myself, I've always made my good offices available, and I work with lots of governments to help resolve conflicts. But the parties must be open. They must be prepared to accept the good offices. They must be prepared to work with a mediator. This is not the case in this particular conflict. The parties have not jointly agreed to accept a mediator or bring in a third party, and have tended to work bilaterally with support from friendly nations, and recently by United States and United Kingdom, and I myself have also been on the phone with the leaders of both countries. I think what is important is that these efforts continue, and that we do not only de-escalate the tensions which exist today and get the two governments to withdraw their troops from the border, because when you have almost 1 million men confronting each other, accidents can happen. So we need to work with them to de-escalate. We need to not only get them to de-escalate, but continue the process and seek a longer-term solution. And I hope that the recent efforts being made by friendly governments will help move the process forward. It is not an issue that is actively before the Security Council because of what I have described as the unwillingness of both parties to refer to the Council or even deal with a third-party mediator and would want to deal with it bilaterally. And if they can do that, well and good, we will support them, we will work with them and give whatever encouragement we can.
Thank you. Would you comment on the United States attitude towards the International Criminal Court? That's an easy one to...
Gosh. President Levine, you have tough students here. No, on the issue of the court, earlier this year we had that big debate in the UN when U.S. asked for a blanket exemption for U.S. troops and U.S. citizens, and that really did disturb member states, particularly those who have ratified the Rome Statutes, and felt that it would undermine the court even before it got off the ground, and were determined not to do anything that will go contrary to the statutes of the court. U.S. has indicated that it's going to try and work out bilateral agreements with governments that will give U.S. citizens exemption. Several agreements, I understand, have already been signed. The European Union collectively review this issue, and they seem to believe they've come up with a compromise where they will not pursue American citizens provided they are put on trial in U.S. courts. This, in a way, is exactly what the Rome Statute says. The statute makes it very clear that where you have a good legal system and the government is prepared to put the accused on trial and to prosecute, the court has no role. It is only in those situations where a government is either unable or unwilling to prosecute that the International Criminal Court can step in and take action. So if they are able to work out arrangements that are in conformity with the courts, with the statutes, and I would not see much problem. But if it goes beyond that and the arrangements are seen as weakening the court, then it creates quite a lot of problems. Even though U.S. has not ratified the statutes, or they signed it and indicated they are not going to ratify it. Some said they have unsigned it. I don't think you can unsign a document you've signed. It's a historic fact. But you may decide not to ratify it, and that says some. But I think if the court gets off to a good start, appoints outstanding prosecutors, outstanding judges, and really begins to do a good job and establishes its credibility, I think I will not be surprised if the U.S. turns to the court, and the U.S. may even need the court much more than others, because the U.S. has far greater global exposure than any country that I know. And there may be situations where they may want to resort to the court to deal with certain situations. Until the court was established, we had to resort to establishment of ad hoc tribunals. We have ad hoc tribunal for Bosnia, we have one for Rwanda, and we are setting up a special court for Sierra Leone. And I had been in negotiations with Hun Sen in Cambodia to set up another court for Khmer Rouge. How many ad hoc tribunals are we going to set up? And in fact, in most of these cases, it's also seen as a justice of the victor. I mean, if you talk to Milosevic today, he would think if he had won, he won't be in court. So you have these kinds of situations. And when we have a standing international criminal court, I think we will get away from all these accusations and all these tensions. And I also believe that we are finally putting in place the missing link in international law, international criminal law. because until these tribunals were set up and until the criminal court was set up, it was much easier to put a man on trial if he killed 1 or 2 people. But when they killed hundreds and were responsible for ethnic cleansing and all, you had no means of getting them. Often they were the presidents, they were the generals, and they got away with it. Here we are, over 20 years later, thinking of what do we do about Khmer Rouge and how do we set up a court to try those who killed their millions. Now we have a court, and I hope it sends a message to those who would act with impunity that they cannot escape. They'll be brought to account, and there is a court that is waiting to put them on trial. And the U.S. as a country, a democratic country, a country that believes in rule of law, I hope in time will find its way to supporting the court. Not today, not tomorrow, but I hope the position is not immutable and that they will come on board.
Mr. Secretary General, what is the United Nations doing to tackle the HIV epidemic?
I'm glad you raised that point. I think it's the greatest tragedy the world is facing today. Africa is the hardest hit, and the AIDS epidemic is not just a health issue. It's a security issue, and it's an issue of economic development. In some countries, it's taken off the most productive people, men and women in their prime. In some countries, it's killing teachers faster than they can be replaced. And life expectancy in some countries is dropping as much as 20 years. And this is a real catastrophe. I spoke to one of, the past weekend, I went on a retreat with the senior UN officials and the head of World Food Program, who is dealing with the crisis of famine in Southern Africa. The 6 Southern African countries had been on a field trip. And he came, he said, I've never seen anything like this. He took his wife and he said, it's changed our lives. That you go to some villages and you see a grandmother, no other parents, her children are gone and their husbands or spouses are gone. And she's responsible for 22 children. And she has to cope with them. And in some cases, even where the people are sick, there's no medication. Hospitals are crowded. And what is difficult, and the most painful one, is the mother-to-child transmission. And the awful thing is that most of the victims today are women, innocent young women and others who have been taken advantage of. And the UN tried to help by setting up the Global Fund. When we set up the Global Fund a little over a year ago, I indicated that we needed $7 to $10 billion a year. We've got $2 billion. It's a good start, but it's not enough, not half, nearly as enough. We have challenged pharmaceutical companies to work with us to reduce their prices and make sure that we can get medication to the poor. And some have responded well. Some foundations, like Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and other foundations are helping. Some governments are doing more to help the poor countries. But I must stress that AIDS is a global epidemic. Africa is the hardest hit, but it's spreading very fast in Asia, in the former Soviet republics, in China, in the Soviet Union, in the Caribbean. And the figures are frightening, that if we don't do anything about these 4 or 5 countries, in another 10 to 15 years, they will have about 50 million infected. So it is a really, really serious problem that we all need to become engaged in. And wherever I have been, I've challenged the leaders to lead the fight, to show leadership, and to mobilize the entire societies to play a role and not to keep silent, and to remove the stigma and discrimination attached to the disease. And I constantly remind them that silence is death, and they have to lead and speak up. So whatever we can do individually, is equally, will be important. And so it's a global problem for all of us. And I urge everyone in their own little way, whatever they can do to help.
Okay. Is the international community meeting the Millennium Development Goals that were adopted 2 years ago, Mr. Secretary General?
The results are mixed. We are not doing as well as we should. And if we are going to meet the targets by 2015, we should really step up our efforts. Some areas have done well. Southeast Asia has done well. They have come down from 28% to 14%, cut it by half. People living in abject poverty. South Asia has gone down from 44% to 37%. Africa has the worst record. It's moved from 48 to 47, only 1% decrease. And if we are going to meet the goals that we've set ourselves, we need to do much, much more. We need to ensure that the assistance, the development assistance which has been promised is given. We strengthen the institutions, and that we also provide access to markets for some of these countries. And in the area of education, ensure that we get more girls in school. There has been some progress, but still the gap has only been bridged by about 25%.
Thank you. And the last question. Do you ever feel limited by restrictions on your authority? If so, at what times?
Do I ever feel defeated?
Do you ever feel limited by restrictions on your authority? And if so, at what times?
Well, I'm not sure I can say that I feel defeated. I find ways of fighting the restrictions.
Limited?
No, I find the way of fighting the limitations on my authority. Because in a way, it's a bit like behaving as a victim. If you behave as a victim, you become a victim. And I think the way is when you've been given a huge job to do, a responsible task, normally you would expect the authority and the resources to come with it. They don't always come with it, but you have to try and determine how you can make a difference despite the limitations that those who give you the responsibility try to place on you, or despite the lack of resources that you need to get it done. You have to find creative ways of doing it. There are moments of frustration. There are moments of incomprehension that I don't understand, that if we really wanted to do this, the will, the resources are there, the technology is there, the money is there. Why can't we muster the will? What does it take? What will shake us? What will move us? So we go through those moments of frustration and wonder what else you can do to get results, to shake people. But you should never be defeated by it. Because if you feel defeated and you give up, then all is lost. Particularly if you are in charge. If the captain gives up, you've lost the ship.
Yeah.